The pandemic has stretched on, and it's not like we didn't have mental health needs before the pandemic. And being restricted indoors, it's been difficult for people of all ages. But mental health is an important topic, whether we have a pandemic or not. So, how do we talk about mental health? To know more, let's talk to Amrita Tripathi. She's a founder of the Health Collective and an author of many books on mental health. More recently, a set of 3 books. The first dealt with depression, the second was on young mental health, and the third, most recently just published, is on anxiety. It's called Age of Anxiety. These have all been co-authored with experts, and this one has been co-authored with Kamna Chibbar. Amrita, thanks so much for speaking to us here on Media Buddhi. There was a time when I didn't know the difference between anxiety and depression, and that these are two independent things. And I didn't know that anxiety could sort of manifest itself in different ways in different people. Sometimes you can have anxiety without even realizing that you have anxiety. So how do we begin talking about anxiety, and how did you approach or tackle that question in your book?
Thanks so much, Venkatesh. For this session, I'm just going to hold up the book so people can see. I think that, there are many, many misconceptions when it comes to mental health, especially, in India, including in sort of urban privileged India. So that's a really good question. Where I came from, and as I started doing some of the reporting with the Health Collective, and more specifically around this book, I realized that there are no dumb questions. I think a lot of times we think that we get put off by subjects because there's a lot of jargon. It seems very complicated, and it's sure, of course, it is complicated. I don't want to pretend that it's a very simplistic kind of field. But we thought we'd address issues like depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues as conversationally as possible. So in this case, I started by asking very basic questions to my co-author, Kamna, who you mentioned, as well as other psychologists and psychiatrists, and people who've lived with anxiety themselves. And the first thing we learned is there's a difference between anxiety when I'm feeling anxious, let's say before public speaking, or I can find an immediate trigger for something that's making me anxious, which you and I might dismiss also as, let's say, nerves, right? I mean, sometimes you feel anxious, sometimes you feel nervous. And that's a very standard, and I'm told, adaptive response. You see a trigger, you'll feel anxiety, you're designed to react in a certain way. There's a difference between that, which almost everyone will face at some point in their lives, and when anxiety is a disorder, which is when you need to seek out professional help. And we can talk about a little bit of those distinctions as we go.
Okay. How do you know that you have anxiety and that it's a disorder? Specifically, the second one.
Yeah, I think I was asking a few folks what some warning signs would be. So a psychiatrist like Dr. Amrita Tripathi, who's done an interview for us in this book, would say that you start to have some concern when how you're feeling is interfering in your day-to-day life. So you might not be able to sleep as well. You're losing your appetite. You can't function the way you normally function. There's no harm at that stage itself in reaching out for help. And the second question tends to be, who do you reach out to for help? And I think there's a lot of confusion there as well. So I would say, if you can find a trained mental health professional like a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you would probably want to call them at this stage and say, look, I'm going through this. What can I do to feel better? And it's not unfortunately, Venkatesh, it's usually not a quick solution, a quick fix, despite what we try to share sometimes, on social media. There are no quick fixes in this. I think we have to also clarify that. But the trained experts are there to help you navigate that journey and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, you mentioned social media. So I have a WhatsApp question. Every now and then you get a WhatsApp forward saying, take deep breaths, do meditation, do yoga, sleep on time, don't worry, eat healthy. So these are very well-meant forwards, but I mean, what's the problem with that? Do they even begin to address the problem of anxiety or any other kind of mental health problem?
From where I'm standing, and again, to emphasize, I'm not a therapist, but as someone who's been doing these, doing the research, doing the stories, doing the interviews, there's nothing wrong with telling people to try and sleep, get enough sleep, eat well, meditate. These are all things that will help you. Trying to tell someone, though, don't worry, when someone has anxiety, not very helpful. I think these are well-meaning, and for me, sometimes it's important to look at that. Of course, people have your best intentions at heart, but fundamentally, what it comes down to is this confusion between the two kinds of anxiety, let's put it that way. Anxiety, which we have as an everyday adaptive response, and frankly, there's a huge uptick in that anxiety during this pandemic. for a very good reason because we're living through a pandemic, right? And the other kind of anxiety. So people confuse and conflate the two. And similarly with depression, from what I understand, I mean, we use these words so interchangeably, right? Depression as the blues, or depression like I was just low that day. I was depressed. I went through a breakup. I was depressed. So in my mind, I sometimes then struggle to think, okay, well, I got over that by myself with some of these well-meaning tips. Why is it taking someone else so much, of a struggle to get through their disorder? And fundamentally, our language is sort of letting us down there, because we're just easily using the same terms for many different issues.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I saw in your book that there's a section on different words for anxiety and different words, obviously, for other issues as well. And that's the thing, right? In many of the languages we speak, Hindi, but also all the other languages in India, there aren't any very clear words for anxiety or depression or anything else. So, is this the only way? Let's make a glossary of terms to use which actually mean anxiety, that kind of thing.
I think it's helpful because, I mean, if we look at, I was asking, and we spoke to a whole bunch of experts, including my colleague Sukanya from the Health Collective, who spoke to a few folks. Kamna has put in Dr. Pathare. Several people have shared what the colloquial ways of describing, anxiety are. What I found really interesting was, Venkatesh, that Dr. Pathare said the most common, even if you travel to rural India or something, will be tension. Somebody will just say tension mein hai, and they could mean anything from anxiety to depression to serious depression. But there's no actual, exact vocabulary for that. It's of course for the professionals to figure out where they are on this spectrum. I think it's important to have these colloquial terms because, again, coming back to how does a jargon help us? It doesn't. I think what helps us is any way we can to expand the conversation so people don't feel, let's say, not included because they don't feel they know the full vocabulary. What is the actual technical expert term? I don't think all of us need to worry about those things. I think we need to know, how can I reach out to a friend who I think might be going through something? What are the words I can use there? How can I equip myself to understand that, hey, maybe actually I could suggest they reach out to someone professional. What are the warning signs? And so on. I think that the idea is to use language, not the other way around. Not get bogged down in too many of those details.
Okay. I mean, that's fair enough. And we'll put together a list of all those terms from your books so that others can see them as well. There's just to switch directions a little bit. What's the difference, or why does there seem to be more emphasis these days on lived experience? I mean, one would think that it's the expert that knows everything, or the psychologist or the psychiatrist who would know everything. So why this emphasis on people's testimonials? And what's the advantage of reading people's lived experiences?
That's a really good question, and that's actually a very nuanced question. I will tell you from my understanding, I wouldn't have even thought about this too much 5 years ago when we set up the website. It didn't, the website actually started with us trying to share helplines, and then people slowly trying to share their stories, and we realized that, this is a safe space we can create where people can exchange what they've been going through. The movement to center the narrative around lived experience is precisely to empower people who are living with a mental health condition. And I'm just going to come back to one thing. I mean, just taking off from your first question. When I started out, I didn't realize that there is a huge difference between mental health and mental illness. It's only through interviews I realized that, we are conflating mental health with mental illness very often. We all have mental health. That's something that we all have, right? Mental illness or mental disorders, or however we term those, are what we're talking about when we talk about anxiety disorders or depression or something that's diagnosable. Even in those cases, the idea now is that you're looking at experts, your traditional experts who are trained to diagnose, to treat, to help people get better or on their journey towards healing. But the actual expert is a person who's living with whatever this condition is. Now, it's also because a lot of these mental health conditions are not, there's so many subjective strands to how you get diagnosed in the first place. But I think the basic idea is that you don't, it's not like a top-down approach, even for reporting. But even when we talk about these stories, it's not that I'm the expert and you're there and I will tell you what's wrong with you. It's always a two-way conversation that helps people get better, right? And who could be a better expert than the person living with whatever condition they have?
That makes a lot of sense, because even when, I have something like the flu, or I mean, just to give the example of COVID, my experience of COVID is never the same as anybody else's experience of COVID, and everyone needs individualized attention. So I guess it makes sense that even when we talk about mental illness, everyone's experience is completely different and unique based on their life experience, and their circumstances, and other issues that affect mental health. Okay, so that I understood that, but when we speak about mental health, or when we speak about mental illness, there's also this talk about it being a spectrum. I mean, what does that mean? It's almost as if you have a spectrum, and then you have, on the one hand, you have people who are healthy, or their mental health is, let's say, 100%, and then it's almost as if there's a spectrum, and at some point it crosses over into mental illness. Is that how you would describe it? And why are we talking in terms of a spectrum anyway?
That's actually a really good point. I think that I'm still, I should put this to the actual experts as opposed to, let's say, other journalists. Is anyone at 100%? I would be amazed if they are.
No, I guess nobody is. I mean, there's that saying, right? If you don't worry, or if you're not anxious, or if you're not depressed at times, you're probably insane. Is there something funny like that? But yeah, sorry, I was interrupting.
I did an interview with Professor Steve Jordan from Canada, who has this course called Mind Control, when this pandemic kicked off. And one of his responses to, one of the questions was that he says, if you're not if you're not anxious right now, living through a pandemic, you're not paying attention. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. The reason it's a spectrum, I think, Venkatesh, is because it's not I guess it's not like some physical illnesses in some way, right? You have a cold, you get better, it's done, right? I mean, though, of course, now we're all learning so much more about viruses and how they stay on in your system forever. So that's not a great example. But the idea is, it's not a binary. It's not a black and white. Today, I'm completely mentally healthy, and tomorrow I have a diagnosable disorder, or I'm mentally ill, or I'm categorized as someone who has depression, anxiety, and so on. No, it might be that I'm diagnosed tomorrow, not today. But the point is that you can be highly functioning. Let's put it this way: you can be highly functioning and be dealing with several mental health conditions. And so, where would we put you on the spectrum then? If it was just black or white, right? I mean, it usually, I think it goes like green, yellow, orange, red. And red is when you're just. And let's say, for example, what we've learned through these books. When are you concerned about someone who might be depressed? In that capital D kind of depression, when, for example, their symptoms and their, the sort of condition of, like, not, let's say again, not sleeping well, not eating well, habits changing, lasts for more than several weeks, right? And there doesn't seem to be an immediate trigger, doesn't seem to be going away. They might be crying jacks. So you would say a person maybe is an orange to red for a slightly longer time. It's a wake-up call for people around. So I think, there's a lot to be gained by, and again, I mean, answering a little bit of your earlier question, a lot to be gained by reading people's first-hand stories, because another thing that's pretty shocking and appalling is how poorly people can be diagnosed, or how long people can be misdiagnosed, and the kind of turmoil that puts people in. So I think it all comes together in a way. If we think of mental illness and mental health as a binary, we probably will feel that stigma and shame, not reach out for help. We won't recognize when someone is in that middle area where maybe preventive help could really work,
Right.
And we then language to deal with it, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Well, last couple of questions. One related to how, as reporters, really, and since we focus on the media a lot in this show, how do we report on mental health, and why is it that we don't have enough reporting or enough, stuff being published on mental illness or mental health? Everything seems to be about the body and not so much about the mind. I mean, that's not a fair question to ask, because that's the way things are. But as someone who works in this space, how do you approach that problem?
I think, Venkatesh, we haven't taken it. Let's say when we were both working in the mainstream media, and I was covering health. Getting mental health stories on air was a challenge, except for certain very specific cases, like involving a celebrity, or something sensational where you think it's going to make headlines and people will be interested. I don't think that, it's not to tar the media at all. I just think societally we also have not been in that place for the longest time to feel comfortable talking about mental health, or more specifically mental illness. There has been no real thought. I think we should check do journalism schools even have sort of modules on, and now they probably will, given what we're seeing the last couple of years, on mental health reporting. How do you report empathetically? What are the facts you need to know? It's one of those things which, also as people decide that they don't need domain experts, I think it kind of becomes a generalist kind of reportage. It will, last year, and sorry if I'm rambling a bit, but last year, the summer, it was the first time I felt really depressed about the state of reporting, like a lot of people. When we saw the Sushant Singh Rajput case, it felt like we have taken 500 steps back. The kind of damage we do when we don't report responsibly on things like suicide, where we know that there are issues like copycat suicide and suicide contagion. And again, as a responsible platform, we do want to share helplines every time we talk about suicide, let people know that help is available. I think it's a fact of not realizing how serious these issues are. The media moving away from specialist to generalist reporting. And also societally, this might be the first time in a long time that we're comfortable talking about things like mental health and mental illness. And maybe this pandemic is a tipping point for all we know. Because all of a sudden I'm seeing a lot more stories in the mainstream about the need to address this crisis. And the experts have been saying that there's it's a crisis that's been there for a long time, right? If you look at the numbers. So I don't know. If I were to say one thing I've learned through the last 4 or 5 years, and we have about 300 stories now on the site if I include everything, it is the golden rule of sort of empathy, and sort of just figuring out how to tell the story with that empathy, and we can go a long way.
Okay, got it. We've one last question, which is we've spoken about how to report on mental illness and mental health, but there seems to be a taboo for us as regular people to talk about our need for help. For example, I'm okay to talk about having a headache, but not necessarily talking about I'm feeling low. You know what I mean? And if you're working for a company, you probably will not take a sick day saying that you've got you're feeling anxious or you're feeling depressed or whatever it is. So there is a taboo about talking about mental health, but should there be a taboo is a question.
There definitely shouldn't be a taboo. And I think that, the more I meet people who are sort of really bravely owning that space of telling their stories in the first person, and we always try to tell them that, you don't have to feel the like shouldering this burden of responsibility is a huge thing as well, right? Because the internet never forgets, right? So you'll always be that person who shared that you live with depression and anxiety. What a couple of the contributors in the first book told me was that they're just waiting for the day that it stops needing courage to tell a story like that. The reason they share these stories is that they were starved for stories like this when they were going through their worst bouts of, say, depression or anxiety. My biggest issue, or the biggest issue with the taboo and the stigma, is that culture of silence and shame, internalized shame, which means that I will not feel comfortable reaching out for help. I won't feel comfortable talking to you one-on-one. And I'm very well aware that it's easier to do these things on panels or, like in a kind of professional setting. But personally, am I comfortable having that conversation at home with my family, with my friends? And I've learned over the years that, there are some stories in my family that are not mine to share, but I have shared. And I've spoken to a few relatives as well about this, that, my family, like many families, have had issues with mental illness in the family. I've written in the Young Mental Health book, I wrote a little bit about some issues I struggled with when I was younger. And I also, I think, had the benefit of writing out a lot of my issues in my fiction. I got it out of my system. But I think until that taboo goes away, and for as long as we keep thinking that taboo because of other people, not us, it's not going to go away, whether we're individuals or journalists or any profession.
Yeah. Well, you've spoken about a little bit about your journey, and it's only fair that I end this conversation talking about my journey. I certainly thought it was taboo to talk about mental illness or mental health. And you're right, every family has this. And I certainly thought it was not masculine to talk about the fact that I worry about certain things or, I feel bad about certain things. So it's also been a journey for me. And obviously, thanks to people like you. So I think we can end this conversation on that note. And I hope anyone who's watching this, if they take a few steps and they realize that there's no shame in talking about mental health or mental illness and seeking help, that'll be fantastic indeed. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And just to end on, Venkatesh, I really appreciate your creating that safe space for everyone and people realizing that they're not alone as a result of this. Thank you.